El Señor de los Cielos. Amado Carrillo Fuentes ran the Juárez cartel at a scale no Mexican trafficker had ever reached. His private fleet of Boeing 727s moved cocaine in loads measured in tons, not kilograms. By 1997, American intelligence estimated his personal fortune at $25 billion. The DEA wanted him. The Mexican government had made him a top priority, and ordinary Mexican citizens had begun protesting the politicians who let men like him operate. So Carrillo Fuentes, while still at the height of his power, checked into a private hospital in Mexico City under a false identity. The surgeons were ready. El Niño de Oro. Rodolfo Carrillo Fuentes had stepped into one of the most dangerous positions in Mexican organized crime, operational heir to the Juárez cartel after his brother Amado's death in 1997. Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the Lord of the Skies, had built the organization into the most powerful drug trafficking network in Mexico through the mid-1990s, and when he died on a surgeon's table in Mexico City, Rodolfo moved into his place. For years, he held the cartel together. He managed drug corridors through Chihuahua and Sinaloa, maintained relationships with corrupt officials on both sides of the border, and kept rivals at a distance through force and negotiation. But the cartel he had inherited was already weakened by internal divisions and by the loss of the infrastructure Amado had spent years building. By 2004, the Sinaloa cartel under El Chapo was pushing hard into Juárez-controlled territory. Rodolfo responded with violence. He targeted men with direct ties to El Chapo's organization. Those men had powerful allies, and those allies had been waiting for an opening. On the afternoon of September 11th, 2004, Rodolfo drove into Culiacán, Sinaloa's capital city and El Chapo's home ground, with his wife and a small security detail. He walked into the Cinépolis cinema inside a local shopping mall. Gunmen had been placed inside the building in advance. As Rodolfo moved through the lobby, multiple men opened fire. Both bodyguards were killed on the spot. His wife was shot and wounded. Rodolfo was struck by multiple rounds and fell. He died before reaching a hospital. He was 37 years old. The killing happened in broad daylight, in a public mall, surrounded by families on a weekend afternoon. It was a deliberate statement about reach. His death did not slow the conflict between the Sinaloa and Juárez cartels. It ignited it. The war that followed lasted years and turned Ciudad Juárez into one of the deadliest cities on Earth, with murder rates by 2010 that exceeded most active war zones. More than 10,000 people died in the city during the worst years of the fighting. Carlos Castaño Gil had built the Autodefensas Unidas de Colombia, the AUC, into the largest paramilitary organization in Colombian history. At its peak in the early 2000s, the network commanded more than 30,000 fighters, held vast rural territories across northern and western Colombia, and functioned simultaneously as a counterinsurgency force, a protection racket, and a major cocaine trafficking operation. Castaño had co-founded the AUC alongside his brothers in the 1990s, driven initially by the FARC's kidnapping and murder of his father. But personal grievance had long since been replaced by power, and by the early 2000s, the AUC was embedded in Colombian politics, the military, and the drug trade at every level. By 2004, that power had become a liability. The Colombian government was negotiating a formal demobilization process with the AUC, and Castaño was growing increasingly erratic. He had begun making statements suggesting he was willing to cooperate with American authorities, statements that implied he might expose decades of connections between the paramilitary network, senior Colombian politicians, military officers, and business figures. His brother Fidel, who had co-founded the AUC alongside him, was among those watching his behavior closely. Inside the organization, what Castaño was saying was understood as a direct threat. On April 16, 2004, Carlos Castaño disappeared. The The Colombian government assumed he had gone into hiding to avoid extradition to the United States on drug trafficking charges. His brothers said nothing publicly. Months passed, then years. Reports began to emerge from sources inside the organization that Castaño had not fled. He had been killed. Human remains recovered from a rural area of Córdoba department were eventually identified through forensic analysis as his. He had been shot in the head. The evidence pointed to figures within the AUC leadership itself. Most accounts indicated that the orders had come from within the Castaño family, from men who could not afford to let him talk. The man who had built the most powerful paramilitary force in Colombian history had been executed by the organization he had created. His death was confirmed years after it happened, in a field with no witnesses and no public accounting. El Más Loco, Nazario Moreno González, also known as El Chayo, co-founded La Familia Michoacana in the early 2000s and built a criminal organization with one of the strangest public identities in the modern drug trade. Moreno distributed Bibles, delivered speeches about morality and community values, and wrapped his organization in a self-created religious ideology, while directing kidnappings, mass executions, and systematic brutality across Michoacán. By 2010, La Familia had fractured under sustained government pressure, and Moreno had formed the Knights Templar, a successor organization that continued to control Western Mexico through the same combination of extreme violence and public religious performance. On December 9, 2010, Mexican federal forces launched an operation against La Familia in Apatzingán, Michoacán. A gun battle followed. When it ended, the government announced that Nazario Moreno González had been killed in the fighting. No body was recovered. Officials said the remains could not be located at the scene. The skepticism was immediate and well-founded. Over the following 3 years, intelligence reports continued placing Moreno inside Michoacán. Former members and local sources told investigators he was alive and directing Knights Templar operations from within the state. His name appeared in intercepted communications. The Mexican government maintained officially that he was dead. On March 9, 2014, Marines and federal police tracked Moreno to Tumbiscatillo, Michoacán, and launched a targeted operation. A firefight broke out. This time, there was a body. Forensic testing confirmed the identification. Nazario Moreno González had been shot and killed during the confrontation. He was 44 years old. The Mexican government had officially announced his death twice, 3 years and 3 months apart. The first announcement had been either an operational error or a deliberate misrepresentation. Either way, it had given Moreno years of additional cover. His confirmed death did not end the Knights Templar. Self-defense groups and rival organizations had been dismantling the cartel's control over Michoacán for more than a year, and by late 2014, it had effectively ceased to function as a unified command. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel moved into the vacuum and within 2 years had become the most heavily armed criminal organization in Mexico, Mano Jojoy. Victor Julio Suárez Rojas had spent more than 3 decades inside the FARC, rising from a rural recruit in Meta Department to become the organization's top military commander and the single most operationally dangerous figure in the Colombian insurgency. As head of the Eastern Bloc, the largest and most heavily armed of the FARC's fighting units, he directed thousands of fighters across jungled territories stretching through Meta, Vichada, and Guaviare. He controlled coca production zones, coordinated kidnapping operations, and managed the movement of weapons and personnel through the Colombian interior with a military discipline that no other FARC commander matched. The Colombian army had hunted him for years across those mountains and river systems. Each time they closed in, he vanished. His fighters knew the terrain in ways no outside force could replicate, and he moved between positions constantly, rarely sleeping in the same location twice. By 2010, intelligence analysts had developed the method that would finally locate him. Suárez Rojas suffered from a chronic foot condition requiring specialized orthopedic boots. Analysts traced the supply chain backward. Specific boots, ordered in specific quantities, delivered through specific intermediaries, to specific jungle coordinates. Each confirmed delivery narrowed his position further. Once his approximate location in the mountains of La Macarena in Meta Department was confirmed through signal intelligence and ground-level tracking, the military began the final phase of planning. On September 22, 2010, Operation Sodoma launched. Colombian Air Force jets and military helicopters struck the confirmed coordinates directly, dropping more than 30 precision munitions across the camp in coordinated waves. Ground forces moved in immediately after the airstrike to secure the site. When they reached the camp, Suarez Rojas was dead. He was 57 years old. 20 other FARC fighters were killed in the same operation. The consequences inside the FARC were immediate and severe. Suarez Rojas had been the organization's strategic brain for more than a decade. The one commander capable of coordinating large-scale military operations across multiple fronts simultaneously. His death left the Eastern Bloc without coherent central direction. Senior commanders scattered to separate jungle positions, and communication between units broke down in the weeks that followed. Within 2 years, the FARC's National Secretariat had entered formal contact with the Colombian government about a peace process that would eventually end the conflict. Several analysts later traced the beginning of that shift directly to the morning of September 22nd. Enrique Plancarte Solis had built his position in organized crime through La Familia Michoacana before co-founding the Knights Templar alongside Nazario Moreno Gonzalez and Servando Gomez Martinez. The Knights Templar was the organization that succeeded La Familia across western Mexico after sustained federal pressure dismantled the earlier cartel's command structure. As with Moreno Gonzalez, whose confirmed death came just weeks before Plancarte's own, in March 2014. 3 years after the government had incorrectly announced it the first time, Plancarte helped construct a criminal enterprise that presented a public religious identity while operating one of the most brutal enforcement structures in Michoacán. He managed the cartel's practical infrastructure, drug distribution networks, extortion systems, and the targeted killings that enforced compliance across the territories they controlled. By early 2014, the Knights Templar were collapsing under simultaneous pressure from federal forces and the armed self-defense groups that had organized across Michoacán, specifically in response to the cartel's years of violence against rural communities. On April 1, 2014, federal police acting on intelligence located Plancarte's vehicle in the municipality of Colón in the state of Querétaro. Officers moved to intercept. The driver accelerated. A pursuit followed across several kilometers of open road before the vehicle left the highway. Plancarte attempted to continue on foot. He was surrounded. A gunfight followed. He was struck by multiple rounds and killed. He was 40 years old. His death came less than a month after the confirmed killing of Moreno Gonzalez. In the span of a few weeks, the Knights Templar had lost both of its founding operational commanders. The organization attempted to regroup under surviving regional leaders, but never rebuilt a coherent command structure. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel moved aggressively into the territories the Knights Templar abandoned, beginning an expansion that within a few years would make it the most heavily armed criminal organization operating anywhere in Mexico. H2. Juan Francisco Patron Sanchez had risen inside the Beltran Leyva organization through the period of sustained internal conflict that followed Arturo Beltran Leyva's death in December 2009. As covered in Section 1, Arturo had been killed by Mexican Navy Special Forces after a 90-minute gun battle at a luxury apartment in Cuernavaca, an operation that shattered the organization's unified command and opened years of factional competition for what Arturo had left behind. Patron Sanchez emerged from that competition as one of the dominant surviving figures, establishing firm control over drug trafficking networks across Nayarit and parts of Jalisco from his base in Tepic. By 2016, he was among the most operationally active commanders remaining in the Beltran Leyva structure, and the Navy had been watching him for months. He rotated vehicles regularly, changed safe houses on irregular schedules, and kept the composition of his security detail unpredictable. The surveillance was patient and methodical. On February 9, 2017, Navy helicopters carrying elite Marines launched a nighttime assault on a property in Tepic, where Patron Sanchez had been confirmed present. The operation began after midnight. Gunmen inside the building opened fire as the helicopters descended. Marines repelled under fire and entered the structure from multiple points simultaneously. The firefight lasted several minutes. When it ended, Patron Sanchez and 11 of his men were dead. One Marine was killed during the assault. The retaliation came within days. Gunmen aligned with the Beltran Leyva organization shot and killed 3 police officers in Tepic in direct response to the operation. Banners appeared across the city identifying the commanding Navy officer by name, with explicit threats attached. The Navy continued operating. Patron Sanchez's death removed one of the last figures capable of maintaining coherent Beltran Leyva operations in Nayarit. The territory did not remain vacant. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel, already pushing aggressively through western Mexico with a force no rival had yet matched, moved in and established operational control over the state within months. Local operatives who had worked under Patron Sanchez found themselves absorbed into new arrangements or eliminated. By 2018, what remained of the Beltran Leyva presence in Nayarit had collapsed to isolated cells without central direction. El Chapo's son. Edgar Guzman Lopez was 22 years old and the son of Joaquin Guzman Loera. El Chapo, when gunmen aligned with the Beltran Leyva organization, ambushed him in a Culiacan parking lot on May 8, 2008. The attack was overwhelming. Sicarios fired from multiple positions with assault rifles and rocket-propelled grenades. Edgar was struck repeatedly and killed on the spot. 2 of his companions died alongside him. More than 500 shell casings were recovered from the scene. The killing was not incidental. The Beltran Leyva brothers had formally broken from the Sinaloa cartel earlier that year, blaming El Chapo for engineering the arrest of Alfredo Beltran Leyva in January. The rupture had already turned northern Mexico into a battlefield between former partners. Killing Edgar was the Beltran Leyva organization's answer to that arrest. A direct strike at El Chapo through the person he was least likely to be protecting, with full security protocols, his own son. El Chapo's response was immediate and documented in scale. Within days of Edgar's death, cartel associates reported that more than 400 gunmen were deployed across Sinaloa and neighboring states to locate and kill anyone connected to the attack. In the weeks that followed, bodies began appearing across Culiacan and the surrounding municipalities, tied, executed, often bearing written messages. Estimates of those killed in retaliation ran to dozens. The violence did not distinguish consistently between combatants and bystanders. The Beltran Leyva organization's leadership understood that targeting Edgar served dual purposes. His death struck at El Chapo personally in a way that no territorial loss or operational setback could replicate. And it signaled to every other faction in the Mexican drug trade that the new war between former Sinaloa partners would operate without boundaries, that no relationship was insulated from the violence, including family. El Chapo's eldest son, Ivan Archivaldo Guzman, who had been with Edgar in the parking lot that afternoon, survived the ambush. He would later become one of the senior operational figures in the Sinaloa cartel following his father's final arrest in 2016. El Chapo had a memorial constructed over his son's grave in Culiacan's Jardines del Humaya Cemetery, an air-conditioned mausoleum equipped with lighting, seating, and a sound system built to a scale more consistent with a small building than a burial site. He visited it. The visits required security details and route planning, and each one carried operational risk. Several people with knowledge of his movements told investigators that those visits were among the few predictable patterns left in his behavior, while he remained the most wanted man in the Western Hemisphere. Griselda Blanco Restrepo had spent more than 3 decades ordering deaths before she became the subject of one. The godmother of cocaine, as she was known across Miami and Medellin, had built her empire in the 1970s and 1980s through a combination of organizational discipline and an appetite for violence that set her apart even from the men around her. She had allegedly ordered the killing of her first husband, shot her second husband, Alberto Bravo, herself during an argument, and arranged the murder of her third husband following a dispute over custody of their son, whom she had named Michael Corleone Blanco, after the character in The Godfather. She was credited with popularizing the motorcycle drive-by assassination as a cartel enforcement method, a tactic her Miami operatives used so frequently that Colombian hitmen on motorcycles became a fixture of the city's worst years. In 1985, the DEA arrested her in California. She served nearly 20 years before being released in 2004 for health reasons and deported to Colombia. In Medellin, in her later years, associates said she had converted to evangelical Christianity and largely withdrawn from the networks she had once commanded. Whether that withdrawal was complete or partial was never established with certainty. Her name still carried weight in certain circles, and there were men who had unresolved grievances that predated her imprisonment by decades. On September 3, 2012, Blanco left a butcher shop in the Belén neighborhood of Medellin in the early evening. A man on a motorcycle followed her to the entrance, pulled alongside her, and fired 2 shots into the back of her head. She collapsed on the pavement just outside the shop door. She died at the scene. She was 69 years old. The method was precise and deliberate. The motorcycle assassination, the form of killing she had brought to Miami 40 years earlier. The tactic her organization had used to murder dozens of rivals and witnesses and people who simply knew too much had been turned back on her in the street of the city where she had been born. Colombian investigators identified no confirmed suspect. The motive was not publicly established. Theories centered on old cartel debts, disputes within Colombian criminal networks, or a vendetta from one of the many families her organization had destroyed in the 1970s and 1980s. Blanco had outlived Pablo Escobar by nearly 2 decades, outlived the Medellin cartel, outlived the Cali cartel, and outlived the Miami drug war that had made her famous. She did not outlive the enemies she had made before any of those things fell. No one was arrested for her murder. The case remains open. The men and women on this list had governed through fear so complete that governments mobilized armies to stop them. Rivals spent fortunes to replace them, and the people who worked closest to them were often the ones who ultimately provided the information that ended their lives. Tony Tormenta's stronghold fell to 660 Marines. Arturo Beltran Leyva was cornered by 200 of them in a luxury apartment, while grenades rolled across the floor. El Lasca was shot dead at a baseball game after a civilian picked up a phone. And Griselda Blanco, who had survived everything the Colombian and American governments threw at her for 4 decades, was killed outside a butcher shop by a man on a motorcycle, the same method she had spent decades perfecting. The most powerful drug lord in Mexican history did not die in a raid or an ambush or a gun battle. He died on a surgeon's table in Mexico City, trying to change his face. The 2 surgeons who performed the operation were found murdered months later. His cartel collapsed immediately. His name, Bai,